Hello everybody and welcome back to another video. No, it isn't another dub for my comic, Where the Humans Go, completely free to read on my website at curlycinemaart.com, but that is currently in the works, so stay tuned for that. No, my dear friends, this is a video on the wonderfully complicated world of character design. More specifically, it's a video on my approach to character design. So I will start this off by saying that I am in no way claiming this is the correct way to approach character design as a whole, but I hope showing my process can bring you all some insight into my little brain and maybe help some of you aspiring artists through your own journeys with some tips and advice. In this video, I'm going to start with advice and writing concepts, then afterwards I will get into my actual process when visually designing a character, with a specific example at the end. Though I will make it clear that the process can go either way. This changes even for me. Sometimes characters within my own story start off as simple doodles that I ended up really liking, and sometimes characters come about as a result from writing the story and then being designed visually. But to keep it streamlined, I will go with the plan I have laid out. This is my first video essay and I expect there to be mistakes. Of course, I've tried to look out for them and rectify them beforehand, but I'm sure some will slip through, and I would greatly appreciate any criticism or contentions you all may have. Now let's get into it. So what exactly is character design? Well, it seems pretty self-explanatory, so we don't need to go balls deep into it. That was childish. We didn't need to do that. Fuck it, it's staying in. But in general, it simply involves the creation of a character and all the aspects that make them up, from their personality, role, and visual appearance. Now, before we get into the meat of the subject, there are a few things I want to lay out first. Before you even get serious about character design, I recommend spending a lot of time studying anatomy. Those who know me know that this is the first piece of advice I give when wanting to improve, and one of the most effective ways to alleviate frustration when drawing in general. I personally have not dealt with the shitty experience of art block in quite a while. Even though years ago my art was downright bad, I always had something to draw. This was because I utilized drawing as a chance to learn rather than trying to always make a pretty picture, and I had characters with stories to tell, which encouraged me to work towards it even more. So instead of dealing with the frustration of always trying to draw from imagination, I was working off of real-life references. The reason you'd want to do this is build up that sweet muscle memory. This allows you to draw from imagination quicker and more accurately, ultimately speeding up your workflow and improving the quality of your work. Even if the style of art you are shooting for is heavily stylized, getting down your anatomy first makes it much easier to break down that anatomy and warp it into whatever style of your liking. Now that we got the basics of the basics out of the way, let's talk about the basics. Before you start designing your character, you should gain a good understanding of what you're creating them for. Is it a video game? Is the video game very focused on a story, or is it solely focused on gameplay? Is it an animation? Is it 2D? 3D? How long is it, and how complex is the animation involved? Or maybe it's a comic. Is it a short story, a long epic tale, or is it a newspaper cartoon with no overarching story at all? All of these will have changes on how you go about designing your characters. As many of you know, I will mostly be speaking from my own experience of designing characters for comics, so I typically design my characters to be conceptually interesting but not too visually complex. Now that we don't have the basics out of the way, let's talk about one more very important thing: knowing your story. The design choices you make for your character can end up having drastic effects on the writing quality of your story. Whether these effects are positive or detrimental rely on both the character you designed and how you choose to write them into your story. But certain design choices can certainly allow for a much easier writing process. Let's compare two different characters of similar circumstances to get the point across, shall we? Ellie from The Last of Us, the one game that ever existed with no sequels ever. There was no sequel. It didn't happen. And Grogu, aka Baby Yoda from The Mandalorian. Now at first this may seem like an odd comparison, but trust me, it will all come together. I'm going to give a very brief synopsis of these two characters for time's sake. Obviously spoilers for these two stories going forward. So in the case of Ellie, she is a special girl in the zombie apocalypse in that she is immune from the virus. The goal, playing as Joel, Bars, is to reunite her with the Fireflies militia group and their leader / Ellie's personal friend Marlene to hopefully develop a cure to the zombie virus. At first, there is tension and disdain between Ellie and Joel, but along their journey, they slowly go through more trials and tribulations and eventually warm up to one another and form a father-daughter relationship. In The Mandalorian, Grogu is a special boy in the post-Empire galaxy in that he is a Force-sensitive baby of Yoda's species with training? Why did the Jedi think it would be a good idea to start training an infant in the ways of the Force? I don't know, but that and all the other reasons why The Mandalorian is a total writing mess is besides the point. The point is that he's special to all the other non-Force sensitive characters that surround him, and that first there is indifference and reluctance for Mando to take care of the child, but he eventually decides to take him in and reunite him with his own kind, that being the Jedi, who Grogu witnessed being slaughtered during Order 66. Along the journey, Mando and Grogu increasingly become attached to one another, forming a sort of father-son relationship. Though these are very different stories with very different contexts, they have similar beats with these cute little creatures piercing the cold, dead hearts of the old, rugged veterans of their respective worlds. Despite this, I believe one story handles this development much better than the other. You might be able to surmise which of the two I am in favor of. In The Last of Us, Joel has experienced the pain of losing a daughter once before, which plays into his fears of getting too emotionally close to Ellie, though he very slowly becomes attached to her as the story goes on. Ellie never knew what it was like to grow up with a proper family. I'm assuming she never even knew her father, as there was never a mention of him. And Ellie's mother ended up dying within a day of giving birth to her. The only thing to remember her by is a letter she left behind and whatever Marlene would have told her. With these two respective histories, it naturally brings conflict that all builds up into one of my favorite scenes of media of all time.
Oh, pull it up, Jamie.
Is this really all they had to worry about? Boys, movies, deciding which shirt goes with which skirt. It's bizarre.
Get up. We're leaving. Come on.
And if I say no?
Do you even realize what your life means? Huh? Running off like that, putting yourself at risk? It's pretty goddamn stupid.
Well, I guess we're both disappointed with each other then.
What do you want from me?
Admit that you wanted to get rid of me the whole time.
Tommy knows this area
Oh,
better
fuck
than...
that.
Well, I'm sorry. I trust him better than I trust myself.
Stop with the bullshit. What are you so afraid of? That I'm gonna end up like Sam? I can't get infected. I can take care of myself.
How many close calls have we had?
Well, we seem to be doing all right so far.
And now you'll be doing even better with Tommy.
I'm not her, you know.
What?
Maria told me about Sarah.
Ellie?
And
You are treading on some mighty thin ice here.
I'm sorry about your daughter, Joel, but I have lost people too.
You have no idea what loss is.
Everyone I have cared for has either died or left me. Everyone fucking except for you. So don't tell me that I would be safer with someone else, because the truth is I would just be more scared.
You're right. You're not my daughter. And I sure as hell ain't your dad. And we are going our separate ways.
Get it together. We're not alone.
Ellie wants that human connection, someone she can call family, while Joel is opposed to that very idea because of his loss, which might be why his and Tess's relationship was so ambiguous in the first few hours of the game, despite there being a clear, intimate connection between the two. He cares about Ellie, but is terrified of losing her, and he believes she will be safer with his brother Tommy. The writing for this conflict has two characters that want the same thing, but their past trauma affects their levels of commitment to one another in different ways. Now let's compare that to the relationship between Mando and Grogu. Well, Mando originally was going to give him away as a bounty to the Empire, but after deliberation and realizing that Grogu was much like how he was as a child, he goes back and kills all the stormtroopers to get him back, and decides he will care for him until he can find a Jedi to reunite him with. Along the journey, the relationship doesn't change all that much. Grogu simply forms an attachment to Mando, as any child in desperate need for a caretaker would. He doesn't offer much in terms of character interaction or conflict. Now, why might this be? It could have something to do with him being a literal fucking baby. Of course, we're not going to get any meaningful interaction between these two characters. If you replace Grogu with a fucking goldfish that the Empire desperately wanted and the story was to reunite him with all the other goldfish, it would be essentially the same story, save for him using incredibly powerful Force abilities for someone his age. He can do Force healing? What the fuck? And before anyone brings up he's actually 50 years old, then that once again breeds the question, why make him an infant who can't speak or have any meaningful interaction with other characters aside from them touching a bit or choking them half to death? My theory is merchandising and the novelty of having a baby Yoda at all. We didn't have this circumstance in The Last of Us because Ellie was 15. She's no toddler, but she's not an adult either. She is immature to a degree and still needs a parental figure to lead and protect her, despite her being extremely capable on her own. She has her own opinions, ideas, and aspirations in life, and those are what connects her with other characters and the audience. And then on the other side, this little tumor can't tell the difference between a frog and food. Now, I know I've been pretty negative towards The Mandalorian, but I'm not saying it's inherently bad to have this type of character. In fact, the age issue I have is totally subjective rather than objective. I realize that. But because the vast majority of the show is spent with these two characters, the stress doll mostly gets reduced down to comedy relief, and I once again question why this is the choice they decide to go for when creating this character. But just through these two examples in this comparison, you can see how a simple character design change can greatly affect the story being told. There are many other little facets besides age that can change how a story unfolds, but being aware of those facets is what's important. Well, that was quite the long section, eh? But I feel it's incredibly vital to understand how your character's design is going to fit into your story and play into the character interactions. Well, at this point, let's assume you've finished writing your character. You've taken into account everything I've laid out thus far and got a handle on their personality and role within the story. Now we can start drawing. After you utilize that very important tool at your fingertips known as Google or Bing, or if you're getting desperate, Firefox, I guess, or no, we're not going to use that one. Remember when I talked about studying and learning anatomy? That doesn't stop. Like, ever. Throughout your journey, you're constantly going to be learning, especially when you're creating a new character. As well, remember when I mentioned that sometimes your character designs will come about visually first rather than through writing. So if that's the case at this stage, now is the time to refine them based on some good reference. The research largely depends on the genre and time period of your story, which will change how you go about researching. If, for example, your story takes place in a grounded historical setting, well, now it's just a matter of finding relevant historical items, culture, locations, and events that will influence how you design your character. You have the benefit of it being based in real life in places that actually existed, taking off a lot of the front load of building your world. Even more so can be said for stories taking place in grounded contemporary times. Oh god. As you're currently living in it and have an immeasurable wealth of knowledge available to you, you could actually visit the places and people you're designing your character off of, or if that's not an option, once again, Google is ready and waiting. If you're in my shoes and ended up creating a fantasy story set far into a dystopian future that was once ravaged by nuclear war and an ongoing conflict between humans and human-monster hybrids, now things change, Dad. It's not any more difficult or complex than designing for the former types of stories, but it's a different set of problems to be encountered. Since it's a fantastical story, now your characters are going to have to be designed according to the rules of the world you have created, and you must be sure to avoid breaking them. So the research is going to involve a lot of referencing to other IPs and artworks of similar genre to your own. but make sure that you are still drawing from real life as well. For my story in particular, I went to other futuristic dystopian stories such as Blade Runner, Cyberpunk 2077, and Metal Gear Solid. Don't know if that counts as a dystopian, but the designs of the characters, world, and tech are incredible nonetheless. Mwah. Specifically, I referenced these for militaristic characters and characters who have implanted themselves with cybernetics. Though I also draw from real life quite a bit, things such as weaponry for these characters and their attire, I tend to rely on real life references. Even for weapons that I create from my own imagination, I try to use real-life weaponry as a basis for it. Now what about my more fantastical characters? That being the human-monster hybrids known as Chimera. There, I'm a little less bound to reality according to how I have written them. They are very diverse in their appearance and their abilities. Sometimes I will research animals, myths, or even fears to design these characters, with a thread of body horror running through. Despite these characters being so far out of the bounds of reality, they fit in so that they don't break established rules and have an air of relatability, as they can be tied back to things we recognize in our own world, real or not. Make sure you do not skip this step, as having plenty of research references will make the rest of these steps much easier. Next step is to figure out the rough construction of your character, that being their shapes and general silhouette. This is where you can play around with a lot of experimentation and stay rough with it. Play around with stylization a bit to give them a distinct figure. This is where you can get down their body type, build, posture, and maybe even poses that are unique to them. And that way you can keep the detail down to make editing this much easier. Now let's start getting more detail oriented. We've got a general build and posture for our characters that we like, but now it's time to really flesh them out. So now I like to start adding in the details. What I usually like to do is get a nice sketch of the character's nude figure in a straight-on view, profile view, back view, and a 3/4 view. This is what's referred to as a model sheet. If your character has any marks on their body, this is where you'd want to add them. I should note that you don't have to draw their genitals, unless you really want to. Anyways, I find having the full figure underneath makes it much easier to visualize how the clothing would react, and it allows for you to test multiple outfits and variations without compromising the original sketch. At this point, figuring out plenty of expressions is what you want to do as well. You don't have to make one for every emotion you can think of, just the basic ones such as happiness, anger, sadness, indifference, etc., etc., and ones that this specific character would often make depending on their personality. After you've really honed in on your character details, color is the obvious next step. This one is more open to each individual. I am by no means a painter. Color is usually something I like to keep relatively simple. But no matter what, make sure your colors are congruent with each other and the environment. You don't want colors to unnecessarily stand out or be hard on the eyes. And of course, have them match with your character's writing. It would be a little strange for a dark and closed-off character to be wearing highlighted, vibrant clothing. Kinda defeats the purpose of the character being closed off. So I've laid out my process for designing characters, but let's look at a specific example. Keisha, one of the main characters in my comic. She's obnoxious, unapologetic, and promiscuous. She acts as an older sister figure to the younger characters and typically butts heads with Toshiko, the protagonist of the story, due to her unruly personality. She is one of the more fantastical characters I mentioned before, being a chimera. This is an example of a character where the drawing came before the writing. I had already drawn Keisha before actually writing her into a character, but there was still research involved when I first drew her, as this was the time when I was creating a bunch of monster characters for fun, which also happened to be the birth of the other main characters of the story. Because she was part of the little monster series, I guess you could call it, I wanted her to have her own visual identity separate from the other chimera of the story. She was to be big, tall, and physically powerful, so I referenced a lot of female athletes and bodybuilders. When coming up with her abilities, I decided to research old monsters and myths, until I eventually happened upon the Oni, a creature of Japanese myth. Supposedly, they are angry, fierce, and physically hulking creatures. It was a match made in heaven. Now, as we talked about before, we get into the shapes. This is just me getting down the rough construction. I can experiment and have fun with how I wanted to build Keisha. Do I want her to be lean and tall, broad and hulking, or maybe somewhere in between? Looking at the final design we actually see in the comic, I'd say it's in the middle ground. She's clearly big and strong, but not to a distracting level. One theme I like to incorporate into a lot of chimera designs is body horror. but I didn't want to make her simply transform into an Oni-like creature. Like I said, I wanted her to stand out from the others. I wanted this thing to look creepy and unnerving, giving it a skull-like face with these bulging eyeballs that don't seem to focus on anything. It's a concept that I honestly took a little bit of inspiration from the Xenomorph design. That creature was designed purposefully with no eyes to be scarier, as you can never tell where it was actually looking or focusing on. Through research, I found that Oni are actually known to have a third eye and long hair, so I incorporated them both into the design. I especially like the hair, as having it partly cover the face is pretty creepy. It's a common trope to have long, scraggly hair cover a gross demon thing's face. I like the idea of having it be an almost separate entity that grows physically from her back, with the unifying factor being they both grow horns from their heads. I will be honest, it can and will make choreographing fight scenes harder, but I think it also makes them much more interesting. Now that Keisha has got a good design concept, we can get into the finalizations, playing around with different outfits and aesthetics. In terms of outfits, I wanted them to be a style that would fit her personality and abilities. So because of the Oni meat puppet, a lot of outfits were designed to have backless tops, which logically makes sense because she wouldn't want to constantly tear through her clothes. Personality-wise, she is very outgoing and prideful, wanting to show off her body, so she wears things such as tight workout clothes, high-cut shorts, and sleeveless tops to show off more of her arms and chest. Keisha is someone who lives for the thrill of the fight. She likes getting her hands dirty in a good old scrap, which is also why she has shorter hair, usually tied in a bun. Can't have it getting in the way when she's breaking someone's nose. Now let's play with some expressions to represent that, as they are common expressions she will make in the story. She has a big ego, so there's a lot of faces such as having a devious look to her, always looking confident, looking down on others. Finally, we can color this big lady. I'm no colorist, I just play around with colors until I find a combination that fits well together and with the coloring of the character's surroundings. One thing I wanted to do was brighten her up to fit with her very outgoing and explosive personality. So I gave her blonde hair and bright fiery orange-red eyes. Her Oni meat puppet was colored to be kind of the opposite of that, with having blue skin and black hair, which also contrasts well with the fire it will conjure. This creates a nice visual break in the design so it's not overwhelming with warm and hot colors. And there you have her, the bombastic and fight-loving chimera Keisha. If you want to see more of her, then check out my comic Where the Humans Go on my website curlycinnamonart.com. I have also started uploading the comic to Webtoons and Tapas, so if those are your preferred platforms, then those are now options. Thank you all for checking out this video. It took a while to make, I know, but as many of you know, I'm a very busy bee. I was working on this, I'm working on my comic, and on the Chapter 2 dub, which we got a whole whopping 160 auditions for 6 characters. I was not expecting that many auditions for 6 characters, but it was wonderful to see so many people interested in the project. If you're a voice actor and you're interested in providing your beautiful little voice to the comic dubs, we host them up on Casting Call Club for each new chapter that I make. I come up with new characters pretty regularly. There's usually always a new character within a chapter. Sometimes there isn't, sometimes there is, but either way, whenever we do, we always put that up there for people to audition for. I hope you all got something out of this video. If you did, drop a like. If not, dislike and let me know what information I could have included. This is the first video essay I have ever written, and thus I expect there to be mistakes. If there are any criticisms that come to mind, please do not hesitate to let me know in the comments. If any of you beautiful souls have ideas or suggestions of what other kinds of videos I can make, let me know. It can be anything, even just discussing media or stuff within art communities. And with that, I once again thank you for watching this video. I hope that my process helped you a little bit with designing your own characters, and I bid you all adieu. Is that how you pronounce that? Adieu, adieu. For now, what language is that? What language is adieu? Someone let me know in the I'm gonna stop talking now. I'm just gonna